Imagine a sky filled with fire and steel, where bomber crews flew with the constant fear of enemy fighters appearing like sharks from the clouds. Now imagine a legend whispered among these crews, a legend of guardian angels with blood-red tails on their planes. They were a brotherhood of eagles who would appear when all hope seemed lost, fighting with a skill and ferocity that was unmatched. The legend said that if you saw the red tails, you were going to make it home. The most shocking part of this legend? It was true. And the men behind it were the very people the Army believed were unfit to fly. A group of African-American pilots in a segregated, underfunded experiment that was designed to fail. This is the story of how they defied a nation to save it. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. In 1941, America was a nation holding its breath, teetering on the edge of a world war. But it was also a nation at war with itself. The ugly laws of Jim Crow segregation were deeply etched into the soul of the country. In the U.S. military, this division was absolute. Black soldiers could serve, but only in menial, segregated roles, as cooks, drivers, or laborers. The cockpit of a fighter plane, the domain of the brave and the brilliant, was considered sacred ground, reserved exclusively for white men. The prevailing and officially sanctioned belief was a cruel and baseless one. African Americans, it was argued in military studies, lacked the intelligence, courage, and reflexes to operate complex machinery like a combat aircraft. They were deemed inferior and incapable of handling the pressures of aerial warfare. It was a wall of prejudice, built brick by brick, with pseudoscience and deep-seated bigotry. But a storm of change was brewing. Civil rights activists and the black press, led by influential papers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, waged a relentless campaign. They challenged the hypocrisy of a nation preparing to fight for freedom abroad while denying it to its own citizens at home. Their pressure was immense. Finally, bowing to political necessity, the U.S. Army Air Corps reluctantly agreed to a compromise, a segregated training program for black pilots. It was to be located in Tuskegee, Alabama, home to the prestigious Tuskegee Institute founded by Booker T. Washington. To many in the military command, this was not a genuine opportunity. It was a political maneuver, a doomed social experiment. They gave the program second-hand planes, insufficient resources, and isolated it from other training facilities, fully expecting it to fail. The failure would, in their minds, provide the proof they needed that black men were indeed unfit to fly. Into this crucible of doubt and hostility came the first class of cadets. They were the best and the brightest from across the nation. College graduates, brilliant mechanics, and ambitious young men who had dreamed of flying since they were children. They arrived at the dusty, hastily constructed Moton Field to be trained by a handful of dedicated instructors, both black and white. They knew the truth. The Tuskegee Experiment was designed to be a cage, not a launching pad. The weight on their shoulders was unimaginable. They weren't just learning to fly for themselves. They were flying for the honor, dignity, and future of 13 million African Americans. Every maneuver in the sky, every test in the classroom was a battle against the low expectations set for them. Failure was not an option, because their failure would be used as a weapon to deny the dreams of generations to come. They were determined to prove everyone wrong. They were determined to earn their wings.
The training at Tuskegee was a crucible, designed to separate the capable from the merely determined. The Alabama sun was relentless, beating down on the tarmac, and turning the cockpits of their PT-17 Stearman biplanes into ovens. The planes themselves were often worn-down hand-me-downs, demanding a level of skill and finesse that newer models did not. Every element seemed to conspire against them. Leading these cadets was a man who was the living embodiment of quiet, unyielding dignity. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. The son of the Army's first black general, Davis was a graduate of West Point, where he had endured 4 years of brutal, calculated ostracism. As the only black cadet, he was subjected to the silencing, a cruel tradition where no white cadet would speak to him, room with him, or acknowledge his existence outside of official duties. For 4 years, he ate alone and lived alone, a ghost in the halls of America's most prestigious military academy. But he refused to break. He graduated 35th in a class of 276. Davis understood prejudice better than anyone, and he knew that excellence was the only weapon that could defeat it. Under him, and the lead flight instructor, Charles A. Emberson, the father of black aviation, the cadets were pushed beyond their limits. The instructors were merciless, demanding a perfection that left no room for error. The academic standards were sky-high. The physical regimen was grueling. The washout rate was brutal, with more than half of the cadets failing to make it through the program. There were no second chances. Every man knew that his individual failure would be used to condemn them all. They drilled endlessly, mastering takeoffs, landings, and complex aerial acrobatics. They learned to navigate by the stars and to fight in tight formations. They studied meteorology, engineering, and the intricate mechanics of their aircraft. In the segregated barracks at night, they would quiz each other, determined that no man would fail for lack of effort. They were more than a class of cadets. They were a brotherhood, forged in the Alabama heat and bound by a common, unspoken purpose. Then, on March 7th, 1942, the impossible happened. The experiment that was designed to fail produced its first 5 graduates. Before a crowd of proud but anxious onlookers, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., Lemuel R. Custis, Charles DeBow, Mac Ross, and George S. Roberts stepped forward. They had endured it all, the doubt, the second-class equipment, the immense pressure, and had emerged as commissioned officers and pilots in the United States Army Air Corps. As their silver wings were pinned to their chests, a quiet but profound victory was won. It was more than a piece of metal. It was a symbol of their triumph, a repudiation of the racist lies that had kept them on the ground for so long. They had proven they could fly. They were now the 99th Pursuit Squadron. But earning their wings was only the first battle. The war in Europe and the Pacific was raging, yet the 99th remained in Tuskegee, an unwanted squadron. The top brass in Washington, still clinging to their prejudices, refused to deploy them into combat. They were pilots with no war to fight, eagles with clipped wings, stuck on the ground while the world burned. The question now was, would they ever get the chance to prove what they could do in the place that mattered most, the skies of combat?
For over a year, the pilots of the 99th Pursuit Squadron were trapped in a frustrating limbo. While the war raged, they were stuck flying endless training missions in the United States, their skills sharp, but their purpose denied. The Army Command, still steeped in prejudice, saw them as a problem to be managed rather than a weapon to be used.
But the pressure from civil rights leaders and allies in Washington, including First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who famously took a flight with Chief Anderson at Tuskegee, was unrelenting. Finally, in the spring of 1943, the order came down. The 99th was going to war. They were deployed to North Africa, joining the 33rd Fighter Group. The excitement of finally entering the fight was mixed with a tense apprehension. They were stepping on to a stage where every eye would be on them, waiting for them to fail. They were not given the latest, most powerful fighters. Instead, they inherited the older, heavier, and less agile P-40 Warhawks, capable planes, but no match for the German Luftwaffe's top-of-the-line Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Their initial missions were a bitter disappointment. Instead of being sent into the heart of the air war, they were assigned mundane coastal patrol and ground attack missions on remote, heavily fortified islands. These were dangerous, unglamorous tasks that offered little opportunity for the aerial combat they had trained so hard for. To many of the Tuskegee pilots, it felt like a deliberate strategy by the White Command to keep them on the sidelines, to prevent them from either achieving glory or failing spectacularly. The skepticism from the White bomber crews and fighter groups was palpable. They were Davis's circus, the Lonely Eagles, an experiment to be watched from a distance. Their performance was scrutinized mercilessly. Because they weren't given the chance to engage in significant dogfights, their initial tally of enemy aircraft shot down was 0. This lack of aerial victories was immediately seized upon by their detractors. A damning report penned by a high-ranking white colonel was circulated in the Pentagon. It concluded that the Tuskegee Experiment was a failure. The report claimed the 99th was incompetent in combat and recommended they be removed from flying duties and reassigned to coastal patrol, a humiliating demotion. The very failure that had been engineered for them from the start seemed to have finally come to pass. This was their moment of greatest crisis. The fate of the entire program hung in the balance. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was summoned to Washington to answer to the committee. He stood before the generals not with anger or emotion, but with the same cold, hard logic he had used to survive West Point. He meticulously dismantled the report, showing how his men had been given inferior equipment and assigned missions that offered no chance for air-to-air combat. He argued that they had performed their assigned duties with courage and precision. He didn't ask for special treatment. He asked only for a fair chance. He asked for better planes and a mission that would allow his men to prove their mettle. His powerful testimony bought them time. The 99th was transferred to the Italian mainland. It was here, in the skies over the brutal battle for Anzio in early 1944, that they would finally get their chance. The German Luftwaffe was hammering the Allied beachhead, and every available fighter was thrown into the fray. On January 27th, the pilots of the 99th flew into a hornet's nest of elite German Focke-Wulf 119s. This time, they were not on patrol. They were in a life-or-death dogfight. In a swirling, chaotic battle, they demonstrated the superior skill and discipline that had been drilled into them in the heat of Alabama. They dove, climbed, and turned with a ferocity that stunned the enemy. In 2 days of intense fighting over Anzio, the pilots of the 99th shot down 12 German fighters without losing a single one of their own. The news of their stunning victory electrified the Allied command. They were no longer an experiment. They were a proven, lethal fighting force. They had faced the best the Luftwaffe had to offer and had emerged as victors. The lies had been silenced by the roar of their engines and the chatter of their machine guns. They had finally arrived.
The stunning success over Anzio was a turning point. The whispers of incompetence were silenced,
replaced by murmurs of respect. The Army command, finally convinced of their value, decided to expand the Tuskegee program. 3 new all-black fighter squadrons, the 100th, 101st, and 102nd, were activated and sent to Italy. Together with the original 99th, they formed a new, powerful unit, the 332nd Fighter Group. And leading them all was the newly promoted Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. With this new status came a significant upgrade. The old tired P-40s were replaced with the iconic P-51 Mustang. It was the best fighter plane in the world, a sleek, powerful, long-range thoroughbred of the sky. It was fast, agile, and armed with 6.5 caliber machine guns that could shred an enemy plane to pieces. For the first time, the Tuskegee Airmen were not just equal to their counterparts, they were equipped with the best. To distinguish their unit in the crowded skies over Europe, Colonel Davis made a bold and symbolic decision. He ordered the tails of their P-51s to be painted a brilliant, unmistakable crimson red. It was a mark of pride, a symbol of their unique identity, and a defiant statement to anyone who looked up. From that moment on, they were no longer just the 332nd Fighter Group. They were the Red Tails. Their new mission was one of the most dangerous and vital of the entire air war: bomber escort. The American strategy relied on massive daylight bombing raids deep into the heart of Germany, targeting factories, oil refineries, and military installations. These lumbering B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators were slow, vulnerable, and hunted relentlessly by the elite fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe. For the bomber crews, the journey into Germany was a vision of hell. Flak would tear through their formations, and swarms of German fighters would descend upon them, their cannons ripping through aluminum and flesh. The losses were catastrophic. On some missions, the odds of a bomber crew making it back were less than 50%. Their only hope was their fighter escort, their little friends. The standard doctrine for fighter pilots was aggressive. Many would peel off from the bombers to chase German fighters, hoping to rack up individual kills and become an ace. But this often left the bombers exposed and vulnerable. Colonel Davis, drawing on his trademark discipline, drilled a different philosophy into his men. Their primary mission was not to hunt for glory. It was not to shoot down enemy planes. Their primary mission was to protect the bombers. "Stick with the bombers," he ordered. "Do not leave them. Your job is to get them to the target and get them home." This disciplined, protective style of flying was revolutionary. The Red Tails became the bombers' guardian angels. They flew closer formations, weaving a protective shield around the heavy, slow-moving planes. They would fight off German attacks with ferocious precision, and then, instead of chasing the fleeing enemy, they would immediately return to their position beside the bombers. Soon, a legend was born among the bomber crews. They began requesting the Red Tail Angels for their escorts. A rumor spread like wildfire through the air bases in Italy. If you saw the crimson tails of the 332nd on your wing, you were safe. It was a mark of survival. The Tuskegee Airmen, the men who were once deemed unworthy of flying, had become the most requested and respected bomber escort group in the entire 15th Air Force. They were not just proving they could fly, they were setting a new standard for what it meant to be a fighter pilot.
The legend of the Red Tails was sealed in the fires of one of the most audacious missions of the war. On March 24, 1945, the 15th Air Force launched a massive raid on the Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin. This was the heart of the Nazi war machine, a target defended by the most advanced and lethal fighters Germany had left,
including the Messerschmitt Ne-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The round trip was over 1,600 miles, a brutal, grueling flight that pushed the P-51 Mustangs to the absolute limit of their range. For this critical mission, the 3rd 132nd Fighter Group was given the honor of providing the primary escort. Colonel Davis led his Red Tails deep into enemy territory, deeper than most had ever flown before. Over Berlin, the sky erupted. The Me-262 jets, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Mustangs, tore through the bomber formations. The Tuskegee Airmen met them head-on. In a historic and chaotic dogfight, they engaged the jets, a battle of propeller versus turbine. Relying on their superior training and disciplined tactics, they did the impossible. While other fighter groups were still learning how to combat the new jet threat, the Red Tails shot down 3 Me-262s in a single day, a feat that shocked and impressed the entire Allied Air Command. But their greatest achievement of the day was not in their kills. It was in the planes they saved. On that mission, one of the longest and most dangerous of the war, the Red Tails escorted the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, without a single bomber under their protection being lost to an enemy fighter. It was an almost unbelievable accomplishment, the ultimate validation of their discipline and skill. By the end of the war, the record of the Tuskegee Airmen was undeniable. They had flown over 15,000 individual sorties. They had destroyed over 260 enemy aircraft. They had demolished countless enemy trains, boats, and military installations. They were awarded more than 850 medals for their heroism, including the Distinguished Flying Cross for nearly 100 of their pilots. And through it all, they maintained one of the most impressive bomber escort records of the war. The legend of never losing a bomber was a slight exaggeration, but the reality was just as stunning. In over 200 escort missions, they lost a fraction of the bombers that other groups did. When they returned home, however, the ticker tape parades were not for them. They returned not as heroes, but as black men in a segregated America. They were forced to use separate entrances and were denied the respect they had earned with their blood and courage in the skies over Europe. The war against fascism abroad was won, but the war against racism at home was far from over. Yet they had planted the seeds of irreversible change. The Tuskegee Experiment, designed to prove black inferiority, had done the exact opposite. It had proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that black men were not only capable, but could perform as well as and often better than their white counterparts. Their undeniable success was a key factor that led President Harry T. Truman to issue Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. The Tuskegee Airmen were more than just pilots. They were scholars, mechanics, instructors, and crewmen. They were pioneers who fought 2 wars at once, one against the Axis powers and another against the hatred in their own country. They soared above the clouds of prejudice and painted a message of equality and excellence across the sky in brilliant crimson red. Their legacy is not just in the battles they won, but in the barriers they broke, proving to the world that the content of a man's character and the quality of his skill are not determined by the color of his skin.
The legacy of the Red Tails deserves to be remembered. If you agree, support our mission with a like and share.
Subscribe and join our community to keep these vital stories alive. We're honored to have you.